What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Iron Culture. It is me, Eric Trexler, joined as always by the Dr. Eric Helms. Helms, how are we doing tonight?
To be honest, I am in a position of great despair and guilt because this is the probably, I think, hitting rock bottom. I know we've hit rock bottom before in Iron Culture, but this is like, we're tumbling down a mountain and maybe now we're at the bottom of it. It's not Monday. It's not Monday anywhere. And here we are. So there was commitments made over the course of the, almost 7-year history of Iron Culture that we'd be here every single Monday until the end of the world. And we're just blatantly breaking it. And that is unfortunate. But I would just ask everyone, all of the long-standing Iron Culture fans, to give us a little bit of grace because this is actually an act of us trying to pull Trexler back from the depths of overworking himself to the bone so he doesn't have to do 2 podcasts on the same day, both Front Page Fitness and Iron Culture. But this is the day we're going to be recording moving forward, and our schedule's changing a little bit, and we sincerely apologize. Do you think I groveled sufficiently, Trex?
Yeah, I think longtime listeners will be confused over the, self-flagellating apology for saying, by the way, we're going to do a different night and changing it by exactly 24 hours. Or, not exactly, but changing it by about 24 hours. I think as far as it goes with free weekly content spanning years, I feel like it's a pretty good bargain, and we've built up enough equity that people will arguably be okay tuning in one day later. And of course, a large percentage of people view it late anyway, and so they will experience literally no change in their viewing pattern.
How dare you suggest that some people are not, that the entirety of the Iron Culture following is not live with us right now? I know I haven't checked the YouTube metrics, but I'm assuming 10,000 people currently watching live.
You would be surprised. So I would encourage you not. That's not the kind of surprise you want in your life. This is not like when you walk in after a day's work and, oh my God, my friends have gathered to celebrate my birthday. The live chat number right now would be the opposite of that if you are anchoring your expectation at 10,000. But nonetheless, every single person in the live chat is appreciated and valued. And we love that you join us live. And honestly, bonus points to the people, the real sickos, as they say, who somehow knew we were going live on a Tuesday night. Because now that I think of it, I didn't tell anybody. But
You
they
did
knew.
put it up on YouTube yesterday, though.
It
That it was going to go
existed on
live
YouTube,
today.
but I did not on social media alert anyone to it. So the page has
Right.
been up and idle, indicating that we would be live. But yes, so we are, like you said, Helms, as a gesture of grace to me, the I would say clinically introverted person who has been doing like 3 hours straight of podcasting every Monday after a full work day, which also involves human interaction and now involves multiple lectures on Mondays. Basically, the choice was either split this up a little bit or I potentially die. Because my
hmm
understanding of my medical condition of introversion is that if I push it too far, it could potentially be fatal. So,
Well,
in an
hopefully
abundance
that
of
was what
caution, we moved
convinced
it.
me to adjusting your contract. Once you said, "But what if I die?" I went, "All right, it's going to be a challenge to have a co-host who is actually not alive." So I guess in this instance, we can let you go back on your contractual obligations. So I don't want this to be assumed that this is a pattern that's going to persist with us willy-nilly changing, the things that we've agreed to. But in instances where it will result in your death, then I'm okay with some of that
All right.
types of modifications.
Well, I appreciate it. The audience appreciates it. I assume there's gonna be at least one person, Holmes, who says, you know what, I could never make it on Monday nights, but Tuesday nights I will be there. So, folks, the new normal time is Tuesday nights at 5:30 p.m. Eastern time. I'm just now realizing I need to change our little border around our live stream because it still says Mondays. I forgot that thing even existed, to be totally
So
honest.
did I, to be fair.
But in any case, here we go, Helms. Before we get into it, though, a couple things. First of all, if you like the show, make sure that you like, rate, subscribe, review. We encourage 5-star reviews. That's really the only type we're looking for at this particular moment. If we ever broaden our horizons and are open to other reviews, we'll certainly let everyone know. So like, rate, subscribe, review, share the show, tell a friend, etc. Invite a friend, send the link, spam the link. Send it to whatever listservs you have access to. In addition, if you really want to be a top tier, platinum level, Ring of Honor supporter, you can become a member of the MASS community. The MASS Research Review is really what makes this whole thing exist. It is the title sponsor of the show. It is a tremendous research review. The first of the month, every single month, we let you know basically what's happening in fitness, exercise, nutrition, specifically with regards to the research. We're not going to give you all the hot fitness gossip unless it actually warrants some degree of commentary. If there's some substance to it, we may address the hot topic, but never the gossipy rumors about so and so. It's always what everybody's talking about as it pertains to new evidence. And in this case, we got a little into that, this upcoming issue on February 1st. We got a little bit into that because the headlines have been dominated, and there has been an online uproar about. I know, Helms. I see what you're doing in the outline, but there's been a huge uproar about the dietary guidelines, and that's what we're going to talk about in today's episode because we do have an article forthcoming, which will be not only in the MASS Research Review in those hallowed pages behind the fortress of a paywall, but we will also be making that particular article free of charge, if memory serves. But before we do that, Helms, we have to also tip our cap, literally, to our dear friends at Elite FTS. That is another way to support the show, is to support the people who support us. So we have a lovely partnership with Dave Tate and company over at Elite FTS. So if you want to support us and them, if you're in the market for any lifting-related apparel or gear, head over to EliteFTS.com. Buy all the beautiful things, put them in your shopping cart, and when you're going to check out, put in that code MRR10, MASS Research Review 10. That'll get you a 10% discount off of your order. So, Helms, as I was getting into, there's been an online uproar about these new dietary guidelines produced by the United States. So I don't know, Helms, if they've made their way out to New Zealand, but they certainly exist here in the States. And, it's really interesting because I'm sure we all know this, being Americans. You wake up the day that the new dietary guidelines come out, and it's really jarring because you go to your restaurant, all the offerings are different. You go to your grocery store, it's completely restructured because these things are taken very seriously, and their implementation has an immediate trickle-down effect into the way you navigate the food environment. But Helms, we have so much to discuss because this has been very controversial. Some are saying it's a return to ancestral wisdom. Some are saying it is a brazen departure from modern science. Opinions are many. Some of them are politicized. So we are going to, on this episode, cut through the noise and talk a little bit about what these dietary guidelines are, how they came to be, why this cycle of guidelines was so different than the norm, and what this stuff ultimately means for us. So, and anything you want to tee up here before we dive into it?
No, I was trying to find a cap to tip to Elite FTS, and I realized I had no cap. And then I realized that's a good thing for the youth, having no cap, I've heard. And I think people are really going to like this episode because it might sound dry, dietary guidelines, but honestly, this has history, science, and culture baked into it, which people are going to be surprised by. And I'm going to say something mean to everyone else in the evidence-based fitness community or those who identify it. I don't think anybody has gotten the full story on this right yet. I've listened to a lot of content, and there's a substantial amount of missing nuance that is related to the structural aspects of how the DGAs are constructed, their history, and the important departures from it, or additions to, I should say, in this round, that I think are really eye-opening, and just the complexity of how these things come into play. And I can't even take full credit for this. Just want to give a shout out. We had some anonymous, we can't give them true credit, PhD RDs who were involved in policy, who gave us some insider information on this and a peer review to make sure that we did not have the blind spots that I am criticizing about the rest of the evidence-based community.
You're telling me that the shadowy figures who have been distorting the dietary guidelines for all these decades are now working through you. You are the puppet, and they are pulling the strings to make sure that they get their bias and propaganda disseminated just the way they like it?
Nay, Trex. What I'm saying is that shadowy influencers who would otherwise be using me as a puppet to persist and continue this conspiratorial dietary takeover of the souls of our nation are actually finally crawling out from the depths of coercion, um, not into the light fully because they're still going to have like the voice distortion and like that dark thing, but they are the whistleblowers. They are the ones who are finally speaking up about these conspiracies and giving someone who's in the limelight like ourselves, who are protected to some degree via our public nature, the ability to speak truth to power.
You just reminded me. One time I saw an interview with someone that they were doing that whole setup with the like voice distortion and like they do the shadow so you can't really see any of
Hmm.
their yeah. But they didn't do it well. So I feel like maybe they were like new to the camera equipment or something, but they're like, well, by the time we get to like post production, we're not going to be able to see a thing. It basically just looked like a person with bad lighting. But you could see like pretty much every distinguishing feature about them. So I hope they're doing okay, Helms, because it was
I hope they're
they
alive.
they did not want to be seen, and they were very much seen. But okay, Helms, let's dive in here. So, like you were saying, a lot of people are not quite getting this right, or at least are missing nuance. Even if they're getting to some of the, even if the vibe is right, the details are lacking. So, a lot of folks seem to think the dietary guidelines are just like a static thing that the government puts out. But there's a lot of different acronyms, a lot of different various groups and people and all sorts of DGAs, DGAC, RDAs, and there's normally a standard process by which this stuff is all put together. And in this case, it sounds like that process was amended, uh, or kind of
Depends upon how you want to characterize it.
amended, putting
Yeah.
it lightly, circumvented maybe would be another way of talking about it. But fill us in here. So how is it supposed to go, and what went down this time?
Yeah. So I think the big so I'll actually call out some content that I've seen that has got it wrong and why the distinction matters. We'll get to. Some people have talked about probably the unanimously liked thing about the new DGAs, the higher protein, as oh they changed the RDA. The RDA did not change. The
Mm.
RDA famously of being zero point 0.8 grams per kilogram. The DGAs do recommend a higher protein intake, as high as double it on the upper end of the 1.2 to 1.6 recommendation, without the RDA actually changing, which is, I think, quite interesting. And we'll get to what an RDA actually is, but it's actually much more related to what do we think will cover the minimum basic requirements of a certain proportion of the population from protecting them from malnutrition. That hasn't changed. The National Academy of Sciences, which is yet another federal government body, is the one who sets the RDAs, and then typically the DGAs are formed to reflect the RDA, but they're wholly separate bodies. So
And that
the
causes some.
DGAs, go ahead.
I was gonna say that causes some difficulty when you kind of. It's so common. I've done this a million times, but when you oversimplify and say the U.S. government says blank, and so like in this
Hmm.
case, if you take that shortcut, you would say the U.S. guidelines now recommend approximately doubling the U.S. guideline for protein, which
Exactly.
which is not very true or helpful.
Correct. And even if you dig into the more specific guidelines, you'll find that the macronutrient distributions in the DGAs still could include the RDA, even though part of the guidance now says 1.2 to 1.6. And that goes to kind of the history of how DGAs work. So that's kind of where we need to start. So there's the National Academy of Sciences, right? They said RDAs. That's a wholly separate process. There is the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, which operate on a 5-year cycle. And then there's the things that inform the eventual dietary guidelines, which we'll get into. And the formation of those is relatively complex. Then there's what the current administration did on top of all of that. So, one of the things that I think this administration generally has done, and I don't think this is necessarily controversial, is they've talked about the existing things in Washington broadly are overly bureaucratic, corrupt, and we need to come in like drain the swamp. and B, the change in government. And this is, I always find this just, I'm speaking generally about politics globally over history, not just the US, that when you have someone come in who says, I want to run the government because the government sucks, I always find that very eyebrow raising. Like, especially when there's not a true revolution and it is someone coming into the existing structure through the existing approach, and it's not a revolution. It is just someone coming in and kind of playing people's populist heartstrings and their frustrations. I always question that
Counterpoint.
because, yes.
Well, no, you explain why, then I'll present my counterpoint.
Oh, thank you. That seems like a reasonable thing to do. Yeah. So, because if you're going to buy into, co-opt, and operate within the structures that exist, but the structures of the problem, explain to me how that works. So then but like I said, the thing is, you wait. Do they go, okay, are they coming in to reduce bureaucracy and actually be a catalyst for change and reform? And typically, in my opinion, Trex, that's not done by adding to an existing bureaucratic process more complexity and less transparency. That is my preamble to what we'll eventually get to as I walk through the history. Now, do you have a counterpoint to that to make this,
I have a
even more
counterexample.
complex?
Have you
Okay.
ever watched a television show called Parks and Rec?
Yes, and I know where you're
So
going with this.
Ron
I'm
Swanson,
on board.
very adamant that the Parks and Rec department should not exist, or if it does exist, should be privatized and work in more of a for-profit function. He recommended putting in coin-operated machines where if you wanted to use any kind of equipment at the park, you would put in a few tokens or
Hmm.
quarters. And a lot of people would say that that show was better with him, and by extension, that Parks Department functioned better with him as the true maverick reformer who came in and had some fresh ideas.
Well, I can't disagree with that at all. And honestly, if someone was like, you know what, screw Ayn Rand, I just want to go with Parks and Rec for a justification of my political beliefs, I'd say fair play, and I actually respect you a little bit more.
Nice.
So I'll say that. Okay, so let's talk about where these DGAs came from. So the first thing that happened was actually in 1977. A very simple 10-page pamphlet came out from quote unquote the federal government, which outlined some very, very basic, here are some goals that you should follow for dietary health. And honestly, they really weren't that bad, Trex, which is bonkers. It's basically like, honestly, it's the core principles that we have kept for the last almost 40 years since. Or no, I'm sorry, I can't do math. Almost 50 years since, right? So this,
So you were like
10
5 when these
page,
came out.
correct.
Yeah.
And or I guess that I think you made me younger than some claims of how old I am. But yeah, in 1977, uh, these guidelines came out from the federal government, and they could literally be encapsulated in a 10-page pamphlet, which you can still find. And we can either put those in the show notes or when we release the whole thing. But these amazing nutrition and your health dietary guidelines for Americans can fit on like one profile based Instagram story now. Eat a variety of foods, maintain ideal weight, avoid too much saturated fat and cholesterol, eat foods with adequate starch and fiber, avoid too much sugar, avoid too much sodium, and if you drink alcohol, do so in moderation.
So you mean to tell me we did 50 years and probably like $20 billion worth of nutrition research, and we should ultimately be falling back on that 10-page pamphlet from 50 years ago?
Yeah, those big things truly, if you look at the evidence base, the most charitable thing we can say is that we have more precise estimates about those things,
Yeah.
not that the directionality and implement has changed,
Yeah, no,
for sure.
I certainly I don't mean to
You're being
misleadingly
facetious, but you're
suggest
not
that it's
that
been,
wrong.
yeah, but it's very funny to me that if you were to ask people all along the way, and especially people who have been clamoring for a lot of this nutrition reform, they would have told you in 1980 and 1990 and 2000 and 2010, we know virtually nothing about nutrition, right? And
Yep.
then you look back at it and you're like, well, 50 years later, it looks like what we thought we knew, we now know even better.
Yeah. Now, I will say that the literature on some of this stuff was not developed as much as would be appropriate for DGAs, because what happened with this came out, and it came out from the USDA, as well as what became, I think, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, which is still what puts out the DGAs today. Um, in 1980, in the early 80s, shortly after this release in 77, there was a congressional hearing and they said, listen, we need more engagement with the actual nutrition science apparatus that exists in the US before we willy-nilly go putting out these 10-page pamphlets and telling people what to do. So this was what started the formation of the DGAC, our second now, or our fourth instance of alphabet soup, because we've got the U.S. Department of Agriculture, National Academy of Sciences, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and the DGAs and the RDAs. Well, now we've got the DGAC. Now you can find stuff on PubMed that does the whole outline of what the DGAC is, and we have a 30-plus year track record of following the same outline, and it has evolved over time with the times. And this is where I think if we were to rewind the clock maybe a couple years before we were currently criticizing the government, we would be defending the government from the last prior iteration of the DGAs against baseless claims related to it being a non-transparent, heavily industry-influenced process. And I will say, at least at the DGAC level, that could not be farther from the truth. So the DGAC, importantly, though, does not set the DGAs. There is a post-processing phase, if you will, from the initial data acquisition from the DGAC to actually writing the dietary guidelines. But I would say, to the credit of the dietary guidelines history all the way until this one, largely what the DGAC committee puts forth is reflected in the guidelines. So what the hell is the DGAC? This is a vetted for conflicts of interest selection of nutrition researchers, many of whom are RDs, so they have the clinical experience as well, across a broad range of nutrition for health and the general populace range that the federal government contracts, but they are volunteers. So they are not, paid. Any conflicts of interest need to be managed. And then they are given the resources of the federal government, essentially in the form of aids and access to resources so that they can do a very arguably rigid process of systematic research synthesis with some equivalent to kind of like a grade terminology of how good is this evidence before they're even allowed to make a recommendation. And they must consult the public, and their meetings all have to be transcribed, recorded, and fully documented. They can't meet outside of them. And they have to do them in modern times live streamed. So the idea that it's actually a shadowy room that nobody knows about, and the people on the committee are essentially food lobbyists, corporations, and the globalists who want to control us with, recommending tomatoes and carrots, really, really couldn't be further from the truth. The only critique that I would say is valid, and this is true, you can find historical instances, is that what the DGAC recommends and that what is finally put into the guidelines is not a perfect one-to-one. So as an example, for the present cycle, the DGAC still happened just like the last one. There was a 421-page report written by the DGAC. And this became a 160th page report of what the dietary guidelines were last time, or if I recall correctly. But the DGAs to the typical American, or like what you and I see, are typically the public-facing guidance that comes from that after the fact. And I think the most notable instance of that, if we fast forward from the 80s to when the government said, hold on, you two agencies, I want to see the scientists actually inform you. And then in the 80s onward, we start having the DGAC informing the DGA process every 5-year cycle and the establishment of how this works. In 1992, after the last DGA cycle, they went, right, we need to do a better job of communicating the stuff to the public. So we're going to take the DGAs and put it into heuristics that are more public-facing. Because where the DGAs really operate, and if you look at some of the behind-the-scenes documentation, it is basically targeting two groups: clinicians, people who are policymakers, and people who are in a position of setting large-scale standards and changes. So one thing we are going to talk about is, does this even matter? Do Americans even follow the DGAs? And in one way, it is factually accurate, and we have peer-reviewed published research to say no, they do not. But it is not factually accurate to say they don't matter, or they don't influence American society or the way people eat, because of the structure of things like food programs, the Department of Defense, the Department of Education, a public school system, healthcare services, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we'll get to that. But in 1992, and this was right when I was in grade school, Trex, the food pyramid came out, right? Not the best pyramid, not even the most legally defensible ideal pyramid. We know what that is. Third edition just got released,
I was going to ask
muscleandstrengthpyramids.com.
if you got any royalties when they came out with that initial food, like if they licensed the concept of a pyramid from you.
I'll say this. You can argue about whether the legal precedent was there first and whether or not my very real Delaware lawyer team won the lawsuit against the U.S. government with the pyramids. But notice what came out this time. Is it even a pyramid if it's inverted, Trex? The 2025 to 2030 launch, the government finally backed down and did an inverted pyramid because they knew they didn't want any of that Helms smoke. And they're not. Do you think you're going to release it just within weeks of when I put out my books and have an actual pyramid? No, they didn't want that smoke. That's the
Yeah,
real reason it's inverted.
no, I think, now that the Helms versus the people of the United States was on its 190th appeal, I think they finally gave out. And honestly, having defended that 40-year lawsuit or pursued it in your shoes, I think you can say that's $1 billion well spent.
100%. I mean, there's a reason why I'm going to be in catastrophic generational debt, and that's the main reason I've chosen not to have children. It's just so it dies with me. But well worth it.
Yeah.
Well worth it.
And look at the bright side.
So
We don't do debtor's prison, so you still get to live.
we don't currently do debtor's prison. I'll
Yeah.
give you that. Yes. Like many things, the U.S. government's a little less unpredictable than it used to be. So we shall see. So anyway, 1992 is the release of the food pyramid, and there are actually some notable distinctions between the DGA guidelines that preceded it and it. There was a much greater focus on whole grains and avoiding refined grains and sugar and the DGAs, the DGAC guidance. But the pyramid is just a little more like, hey, generally carbohydrates are good. And I don't think that's an invalid critique. And like most fitness myths or dogmatic beliefs, we've talked about this, misinformation, disinformation, there's always a kernel of truth. So when you hear the narrative that America is sick and we have been poisoned by bad dietary guidelines and we've been influenced by big food and we were, demonizing fats and promoting sugar, for the last 30 years, and that's why the obesity epidemic is here, that is false. But there did seem to be some influence, probably from industry, which did result in some slight changes in the food pyramid. I think that's an accurate take to think that might have been part of the reason why the DGAC guidance was ultimately maybe not represented perfectly in the 1992 pyramid. Do you think that's fair, Trex?
100%. And yeah, I think nuance is really tough, Helms. It's just not
Hmm.
it's not easy. Never was. It's not getting any easier these days. But here's the thing. You got to find that middle ground between being like totally naive and so cynical that you can't function in society, right? And I think when it comes to like
Skepticism, not cynicism, right?
exactly. So for example, in this particular case, the ongoing persistent existence of food lobbying entities would suggest I don't think all these food industries have just been setting money on fire, huge bundles of money for like 70 years straight and had no returns on that. Like the fact that
Correct.
food interest lobbying groups exist tells you they are there to purchase some degree of sway within some kind of framework and guardrails, right? And so ideally we'd prefer, frankly, that those didn't really exist, at least not in the context of, trying to, get Washington to budge this way or that way. Like you can understand having, groups to advocate on behalf of, dairy farmers, soy farmers, whatever, just to kind of say, hey, we're struggling because of this, crazy tax that get put on this thing, right? So I understand, having, essentially public spokespeople for an industry, but yeah, there's definitely like food lobbying groups that spend a lot of time in Washington, D.C. and spend a whole lot of money there. And clearly they want to get something, right? Uh, and
Yeah.
it's okay to acknowledge that and say, I wish that weren't the case, but it also doesn't mean, forget everything that we believe we know about nutrition. There's got to be some space in the middle. And even if there is a little bit of tug of war that's kind of moving the center line on some of these topics, a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right, it doesn't mean that, every person on every committee associated with this is completely bought and paid for, right? There's levels of
100%.
nuance and gray areas.
And very importantly is that I think the formation of the DGAs, yes, there is probably some corporate influence because that's ultimately federal agencies, two federal agencies who are at the whim to some degree, even with the checks and balances we have in the US system, to the current administration, who is to some degree influenced by the PACs, the lobbyists, the corporate influences, wherever the hell they got their money to get elected, and the people in various positions who have maybe spoken or unspoken obligations to the people who helped them get in power. That final little process of then the DGAs getting formed, yes, there's corporate and political influence. The DGAC, though, I think is actually about as close as one can get to ensuring that there is not anything more than just personal biases, the same type of biases you and I have as researchers. We believe this based upon our interpretation of the data, and it is biased because we operate in a human mind, and there's no way around that. So the DGAC, I think, is from an evidence-based perspective, there are data to indicate they are not victim to wide-scale bias that would influence those recommendations. But the DGAC recommendations then ultimately have to get translated. But I think there's a limited degree to which they can be subverted for the final guidelines, which takes us to what the heck was different this time, Trex. So really uniquely and quite interestingly, the narrative that has come from the paleo, carnivore, low carb, and ancestral health kind of
Easy,
not
easy, easy,
broadly,
easy, Helms. Now that I
not broadly,
now
not
that
broadly.
I did my postdoc in evolutionary anthropology, so this is the grift that I'm paving the way for. So easy with
Okay.
all the pejoratives, but go on.
So there are certain segments within these communities which are very conspiratorial. Can we acknowledge that?
Yes.
These okay, they're radical bad apples. They don't represent the broader paleo diet
Yes.
focused community. But these radical bad actors, these fundamentalists who don't represent the true principles of what you and the other good people on Team Evolutionary Biology believe, have generally promoted this narrative that we are poisoned by these guidelines, corporate influence, big food, which again, like you said, has a grain of truth. What's crazy to me is that that narrative has now been adopted by the current administration and was their justification for, believe it or not, adding an entirely separate second committee on top of the DGAC.
And again,
So
this second committee, the purpose was to cut through all the bureaucracy. That is.
the second committee explicitly basically has the same exact goal as the DGAC, but the justification for their existence is that the prior administration, I guess the Biden administration in this case, was so heavily influential in the DGACs that it became politicized, and it was all based upon, I think, the main justification, if you read the preamble, because this second committee's whole justification for existence is to basically be a peer reviewer and auditor to the DGAC, which of course has its entire peer review, auditing, transparent process that's established for over 30 years. But apparently what we really need is a second committee with less oversight, transparency, to just basically completely countermand and do whatever they want. And function, while it's presented as we're another layer of peer review, it's basically saying here's an excuse for the current administration to have license to do what they. Trex, how we doing?
Okay, we are back. My internet dropped.
Trex, how we doing?
Okay, we are back. My internet dropped, but it's back live, and we can just pick up right where we were.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. So where was I? I was saying, I think when we cut out, I was mentioning that they basically created a second committee that was presented as another layer of auditing and peer review, but essentially functioned as the license to countermand and do whatever they wanted
Correct.
under the veneer of there being a fundamental issue with the DGAC, which was largely put forth as the last administration, what would be the Biden administration, having too much of a equity focus, that trying to serve for political reasons, groups for equity, for politically motivated ideological reasons, they were not following the evidence. Now, the interesting thing about that is if you talk to, if you listen to some statements by, say, like Professor Christopher Gardner, as an example, who served on the committee, they had a mandate to try to provide more information to underrepresented groups for the 2020 to 2025 cycle and the 2025 to 2030 cycle. But because of the systematic guidelines in the literature, essentially could do almost none of that because there wasn't enough data on these, not as well represented ethnic groups or age groups in the literature. So they had to kind of fall back on going, well, we don't have that, so we're going to have to kind of assume that you operate in the same way as the other humans that have been done in nutrition science. So there's a specific Instagram reel which I linked from Christopher Gardner, and there's even a longer interview with some of the DGAC folks on Sigma Nutrition Radio, which I think are both worth listening to, where they talk about this process and they explain how they had a mandate to do certain things by the government, which you could argue is politically motivated, positive or negative. I'm not here to make statements about values, but the facts is that they weren't able to create specific guidelines for specific groups in America, even though that was what the politicians mandated them to do. So they had to ultimately just say, hey, here's the data we have, so here's what we can present. So the primary critique that you will find in the actual second committee's preamble largely falls flat if you actually know what the DGAC could do. So the second committee is called the Scientific Foundation for the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. So now we have the Scientific Foundation for the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, as well as the Dietary Guidelines for Americans Scientific Advisory Committee. They both exist, and they both presented competing reports. Unfortunately, though, the processes for the DGAC, which are well established, transparent, rigid, systematic, they're not. I'm not saying that this new committee doesn't have any oversight and it's not transparent or they didn't do a good job. But if we compare what was created, there's a 421-page report that was done over a longer time period with a larger number of people, with a more transparent process, who were vetted and followed a rigid, systematic process of creating their guidelines. And then we have an 8-person committee that only has one RD, and they are leaders. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with the people on this committee. If you're a nationally recognized nutrition scientist and the federal government says, hey, we're going to form a second committee and we want to have you inform the dietary guidelines, you're going to say, yes, I would, right? It's just the way it is. And then they're going to do what they do with these reports. Ultimately, the blame falls at a higher level here. So I'm not saying there's anything wrong with this group. With that said, this preamble claims they followed an evidence-based process, that it had oversight and all those things, and they didn't have conflicts of interest. I would say that may be true, but everything can be quantified. Not everything. Many things can be quantified. And if we were to say which of these two processes or these two committees probably has a more foolproof or protected system for ensuring that it's evidence-based and that it's not influenced by bias, it's going to be the DGAC. It's very difficult to objectively, claim that. So anyway, what we have here is an added layer of complexity and bureaucracy from a administration who's saying that it's going to make things less bureaucratic. And ultimately, their report is basically saying, here's all the things that the dietary guidelines have been recommended to do. Here's where we agree in part, disagree or fully agree, partially agree, or disagree, and we've changed it. And it's very clear that the dietary guidelines are just based upon the second committee. So the DGAC, these volunteers who have worked from the last cycle until this one, are understandably a little ticked off. Basically, their advice was not followed, and in some cases, that could be construed as it didn't matter in terms of the actual what. So I'm talking about the how right now, and I think the how is problematic, right? Added complexity, reduced transparency, and okay, that's not great because I have much more confidence in evidence-based, rigorous, transparent, robust process. But what are the actual guidelines becoming? And I think that's where we can talk about next. For the most part, you could say this doesn't matter, Helms. Like basically, the guidelines tell you to do the same thing. Or some people online will say, "Oh my God, this is a huge departure. This is going to, give people cardiovascular disease." And you hear other people saying, "Actually, this is great. Less processed food, more protein. This is what we've been needing forever." And then even on the extreme ends, you can hear people saying, "Finally, we're there's people are talking about how seed oils are bad and how beef tallow is good to cook with and butter isn't the enemy, and we're stopping the war on fats, and we're stop being influenced by big grain." I think none of those perspectives is entirely accurate. Um, and what is being promoted and the lip service to some of those extremist groups I talked about that's being paid, I don't think is actually being reflected. Like if you took someone who is hardcore carnivore, and if they just heard some of the things that politicians have said, like an RFK, for example, rather than what's actually written, they might have some whiplash. They might think, or even what's shown in the pyramid, the inverted pyramid, I should say, versus what's written in the actual current DGAs are not the same. So we can quibble about the what, and we're going to get into it. I think as MASS, the four of us, we have basically four things we want to talk about as far as the what. But the thing we really wanted to talk about initially is people are really missing how the process was subverted, how robust the process was before, unfortunately, and not this time because it got subverted, and that the RDA, the DGA, the DGAC are not the same, and that you have the USDA, the National Academy of Sciences, the Department of Human and Health Services, and now this new committee, all operating at the same time, and it is far more complex than people realize. So that's kind of where we're at. Things have happened. This new cycle of DGAs have changed, and now maybe we should talk about like the what actually has changed. And in some cases, not much. In other cases, surprising amount.
Yeah, yeah. So let's dive into the what. I think you made a strong case for the difference in procedures and the shortcomings of how that would play out. But first things first here, a topic very near and dear to your heart. We had the protein change, which you alluded to previously. So the recommendation in the DGA jumped to a daily intake of 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram. So what are your just kind of reflections on that change in isolation?
I think in isolation, this is hard to argue as anything but a relatively positive change. I think everyone in the fitness industry immediately thinks about things like, the Morton analysis, which you and I both would argue is outdated. Ironically, this new committee used that as justification for this. I don't think they should have.
Were
But
they
let's say
were
we
they
use
were
the
they just
Nunes.
going through like volume 3 of Mass, and that is basically the basis for the new guidelines?
Pretty much.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. They were
Oh,
going off the second edition pyramids.
before
That's
we move
right.
on to the next one, remind me to ask you about the pyramid. But yeah, go on about protein.
Oh, we'll talk about the pyramid because that's
Okay.
kind of like the communication around it
Okay.
because it's
Okay.
quite different than the actual written guidance. So yeah, this suggestion of consuming between 1.2 to 1.6, actually at the higher end, doubling the RDA, is associated with better health. Now, the fitness industry focus on that, and we immediately think of meta-analyses on people doing resistance training
Right.
as the kind of evidence, and that does really change things. And if you told me, okay, I can wave a magic wand and the entire American society starts lifting weights and exercising, or consumes 1.2 to 1.6, it's either lift weights and consume the RDA or double the RDA and don't lift weights. Every time, hands down, I'm saying I want everyone to start lifting weights. So I think it's important to acknowledge that a lot of the data which shows, hey, this is a good protein intake range, is because it supports resistance training adaptations. But even in absence of that, if we just look at epidemiological data and interventional data, it's pretty clear that metabolic health, musculoskeletal health, all cause mortality, are generally, although a small effect size, better when you're consuming in this recommended protein intake range than below it. And I think the data is relatively clear on that. So that's, like you asked, in isolation. I think the problem though is that while I can say academically in isolation, this is a good thing for sarcopenia, satiety, body composition change, protein isn't eaten in a vacuum. People don't eat macronutrients. They don't even eat foods, as you said. They eat diets. So what really is going to happen here is that people are given a collection of recommendations that they're not going to read, but they are going to see this inverted pyramid, which I'll talk about next. And they're going to make changes to their diet, and they know they're supposed to eat more protein. And the way most Americans eat protein is not through, I don't know, non-fat, high-protein Greek yogurt, whey protein, egg whites, and, boneless, skinless grilled chicken breast and cans of tuna, like maybe I do. But through, oh yeah, yeah, so like let's have more barbecues, right? Or cheese or what's high in protein. They've been misinformed. They're like, oh, nuts, right? So this comes to how things are communicated, not just what is specifically communicated. The inverted pyramid, let's talk about it. If you actually look at it, what you see is something that I would argue really doesn't reflect the written guidelines. You have, at the bottom of this pyramid, you've got grains, right? And it doesn't even, in indicating you should consume less of this. And what shocks me, Trex, is it doesn't even necessarily specify refined grains. It says whole grains at the bottom, like the least important thing here. And it has like a bowl of oatmeal and like a loaf of bread. And I'm like, oh my God, like it doesn't have pictures of sugar, cereal, or things like that to be the least important, like item of your food. It says like basically whole grain should be the smallest component of your plate. Now, going back to it, the 1992 pyramid was released after the DGAs. It had some issues, right? What was almost universally loved by educators and RDs, and that was really useful, was the MyPlate transition, which I think either happened after the 2010 or 2015 version of the DGAs. And a set of online interactive tools and a visual plate which helped Americans understand what their actual meals should look like. This was even adopted by the athlete's plate that is being used in the sports hall at the IOC and like in Colorado Springs. This is what sports dietitians use to help athletes construct their sport performance supportive diet that also is in line with dietary guidelines. So like plates and these visual representations and these interactive tools were universally loved, and the MyPlate tools were awesome, and they were actually quite different and improved upon the pyramid, even though these conspiratorial segments of the nutrition kind of ecosphere are constantly attacking the pyramid, which we haven't used in 30 years, right? 92. So MyPlate, pretty cool, but it was released after the DGAs. It was based upon them. The unique thing, in addition to having the second committee for the current DGAs, is they released the inverted pyramid with the written guidance. And also, if you go to myplate.gov right now, it redirects to realfood.gov. And realfood.gov, honestly, if you'd showed it to me and I couldn't see the address bar, Trex, I would think it was probably the nutrition page of a CrossFit box somewhere in middle America, right? Because it looks exactly like that same conspiratorial messaging. It actually literally starts with a statement that says, America is sick. And then it talks about how the prior guidelines, again, from the government, this is the government talking about itself in retrospect with these conspiratorial tones, misled you. After misleading, biased, prior guidelines, We now have a sick America. It doesn't explicitly say that, but it certainly uh, suggests that, if you will. Now we have the new truth, and then it shows the new pyramid, and then there's the message to eat real food. Now, this website may change. This is happening very quickly, but here's the exact quote, just so people know I'm not being hyperbolic. For decades, we've been misled by guidance that prioritize highly processed food and are now facing rates of unprecedented chronic disease. And then the sequence ends, and there's the message to eat real food. I just find this ludicrous. We've never had guidance to eat highly processed food. The closest little factoid of like nugget of truth here is that the DGAs in the 90s, the written guidance was to eat whole grains, and that whole grains and carbohydrates were the bulk of your diet. And then there was no distinction between refined and whole grains when that actually came to the public facing stuff. So there's that. You could argue that. But now we have an inverted pyramid that is saying eat the minimal amount of your diet being whole grains. At least that's the visual message. And here's what's even crazier to me. If you look at the written guidance from the current DGAs, Trex, what do you think is still the largest proportion of the recommended diet based upon number of servings?
What am I supposed to be looking at to give you this answer? The pyramid or the DGAs?
Well, the DGAs, I know what their number of servings are,
Yeah.
but based upon the inverted pyramid, what would you think in terms of portion sizes is the largest part of your plate based upon that visual?
So here's the problem, Holmes, and this is what I was going to ask you about that I told you to remind me. So I was discussing this with the Dr. Lauren Colenso Semple, and I can't, maybe my brain is broken. I can't make sense of this inverted pyramid. I don't understand the
Not alone.
directionality because there seems to be some introduction of an X and a Y axis where it has previously always been vertical. If you were to ask me what I'm supposed to eat, I would just say turkey and broccoli.
There you go, right? There's a whole turkey at the top next to a huge,
It could be a
obviously
tree.
not scaled right.
It could be a
I
tree
mean,
of
maybe
broccoli.
it's GMO. It's GMO.
Yeah.
It's the same size as a whole, clearly either a whole Christmas or Thanksgiving turkey head of broccoli, for sure. So either way you shake it, I think the most charitable interpretation here is, okay, I think the visual space being taken up at the top and then it tapering down indicates what you should primarily be eating is protein, dairy, and healthy fats and vegetables and fruits. And that should be the dominant part of your diet, and then a very, very small amount of whole grains at the bottom.
Right.
And if you try to give it, and being charitable here, again, maybe an inclusion-based rather than an exclusion-based framing on this, because it's true there are no processed foods, depending upon how you define that, on this list. Maybe, okay, it's all quote-unquote real foods. Maybe everything is good to be eaten, but whole grains are just a small part of it, and you should be eating blocks of cheese, whole turkeys, broccoli, peas, carrots, and steak.
And they went out of their way to show
more than salmon.
They went out of their way to show a whole bunch of white on that steak. That is a heavily marbled, very gristly steak.
It certainly is.
So this was my big concern, Helms, was that I looked at this at first and was just like, what is the like 2 or perhaps maybe there's 3 dimensions I need to be accounting for here? I cannot make sense of what is supposed to be the priority. And to make things weirder, actually going to this realfood.gov site actually clarified it for me a little bit because they broke it, at least in that, as you scroll through, it's kind of one of those annoying interactive like web app things, but it broke it into 3 sectors. There's protein, dairy, and healthy fats with a dividing line, and then vegetables and fruits, and then another dividing line, and then whole grains. But in the actual pyramid, they forgot the dividing line in the middle between the protein, dairy, healthy fats, and the vegetables and fruits. And so basically, like, if you were to ask me to give an honest interpretation of what this pyramid says, it would be don't eat grains. That's the only...
Yeah, there's actually a line over the whole grains.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah, there is a border line that basically built a fence to keep whole grains out of the pyramid, basically. And that is the only directionality that I can really ascertain from this image. Otherwise, like if you're telling me top to bottom is good to bad, then it looks like the base of my diet should be a giant hunk of cheese. If you're telling me that it's better as I go from like left to center, there's all sorts of instances where that doesn't make sense. So I can't tell if near the top is good or on the boundaries is good or toward the middle is good. The only thing that jumps out to me is don't eat grains.
Yeah, that's essentially like no matter how you dice it, you're you're interpreting that whole grains are either the smallest part of your diet or should actively be excluded. But Trex in the written guidance, would you believe it or not, just like in prior iterations, by number of servings, whole grains are still the highest proportionally recommended food group in the written guidance.
Yeah.
So
From
in
that
what I
got
would
through
argue
this that got
is,
through this second committee.
well, that's the thing. It's like I guess, like there's only, this is why it's important just to acknowledge like how much political influence can you have in the U.S. system, at least in this stage of our history, without it being just so blatant that it's obviously like entirely corrupt. And the answer is not enough to totally change the DGAs. So while we're quibbling over this visual representation that doesn't actually follow the written guidance, because the written guidance is largely the same, it still recommends almost all of those same 7 things that were recommended in 1977. I would say 80 to 85% of what was recommended in the last cycle is still recommended this time. Because even if you get, the protein and the high fat and the maybe the cholesterol heart hypothesis skeptic researchers together, they're still researchers, right? They can't completely deny evidence. They might interpret it different than you and I. They might be out of step with a certain few things or a little more skeptical. But ultimately, like the guidelines broadly still suggest eating whole foods as they have, despite the realfood.gov website. They've never recommended eating processed foods. They haven't explicitly recommended against eating processed foods in the same way, which is the next topic. But what we're seeing here is that broadly hasn't changed. Increased recommendation for protein, which maybe with a good visual aid wouldn't be an issue. But right now, what we see is don't eat any whole grains, and it should be steak and whole turkey breast, maybe whole chicken, not even breast, sorry, whole chicken and whole turkeys, right?
Yeah.
So I, along with some of the other guidance, which we're going to get into, and I'll ask you about when we get into the fats side of this, I don't think the protein recommendation is going to result in this proportional increase in protein and commensurate decrease in sugar and unhealthy fats to get it like we would recommend in practice in the fitness industry. I think it's just going to be people going, cool, so I guess I'll just keep going to barbecues. That's going to be the substance to this of actually what happens.
Yeah, and I think something that's also worth noting is it seems like about every 6 months you read an article on some kind of like, you know, health related website that basically says like panic, Americans are eating too much protein. It basically just means like the RDA is only 0.8, but people are averaging 1.2 in this new study.
Yep.
And so it's like if you think this is going to have a dramatic like popular, even if we assumed widespread adoption, the idea that just in a vacuum saying we're going to eat 1.2 grams per kilogram now, the idea that that would meaningfully or tangibly impact health, even if implemented under the best scenarios or conditions, it's probably not going to have a huge difference because Americans generally didn't eat the RDA level of protein anyway. We often go above it because we like meat.
Yeah.
We like to eat meat.
Yep.
Yeah, but anyway, Helms, so you kind of led into a discussion about fats because you said like if the idea is we're going to increase protein and have concomitant reductions in like sugar and unhealthy fats, one of the big challenges there is the definition of healthy fats has been a little bit distorted. So healthy fats was redefined, correct me if I'm wrong, to include animal fats, full fat dairy, and eggs, with an explicit recommendation to use butter and tallow for cooking. And so if those are defined as healthy fats, and Helms, you've been way deeper in these recommendations than me, what then would be an unhealthy fat?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it'd be good to get your perspective on this because there is a lot of nuance to what do we consider a healthy and unhealthy fat. And I know you've done some deep diving into the research here, like the heart health hypothesis it's been attacked by those kind of same conspiratory voices. But it's tough because you're fighting an uphill battle with what the actual research says, because it's not just cholesterol that's bad. We go, oh, okay, hold on. So there's HDL, there's LDL. Then we go, well, there's LDL, but there's also ApoB. The other ones are a little fluffier and they don't get stuck in your arterial wall. And it's more of an issue if you're also an ApoA allele carrier. And by the way, saturated fat does drive up LDL, but not all saturated fat. So there's some, like there's stearic acid, there's stearic acid, like it becomes very complex.
Hmm.
And we can take a step back and we can say, well, there's very clear science as to what happens when you reduce LDL, and then a step back further from that, what happens when we reduce, dietary sources of LDL and keep them in different levels. And that's kind of the level about as quantitative or specific as you can get for public health advice to actually be taken up. We can't start recommending specific, like hydrogen carbon chain locations of fat and then talking about the interaction effect of genes in public health guidance.
Yeah.
So it's challenging, but the guidance specifically, just like I think there's a disconnect between what the pyramid shows as far as what you should do with health guidelines versus what you should do with whole grains versus what the actual written guidelines say they should actually be the largest part of your diet in terms of servings. There's a similar disconnect in the fat guidance. So they specifically do explicitly kind of add a few fats to what is considered healthy. Like, don't get me wrong, they still say, like, fish, olive oil, those things are good. And they do actually recommend, ironically, nuts and seeds, but not oils, because that changes everything.
Yeah.
And they have an argument, which I'm sure you can speak to. But they have a disconnect as well, as they retain what has been there for decades, a less than 10% of calories from saturated fat guidance, while including animal fats, full fat dairy, eggs as healthy fats. And here's the crazy part, explicitly recommending that people cook with butter and beef tallow. Those are called out specifically, not just olive oil and other types of oils that are on that healthy fat list, but that's called out specifically in the more public-facing guidelines, which, I mean, at best, this is just going to be a mathematical challenge. But I don't know. I want to kick it back to you. You've done a lot more of the digging into the crates per se with the research on, heart health, fatty acid types, propensity for it to actually lead to cardiovascular disease outcomes and all-cause mortality.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you did a good job summarizing it. I mean, if someone were to say, what is the kind of statement that could be packaged for public health in a way that would be both practically useful and reasonably in line with the evidence, it would be, you should limit your saturated fat intake. Like that would be the kind of the thing that's fit for purpose in a public health messaging perspective. Now, if someone were to come in and say, well, actually, there's these complicating factors, they would be correct. And so, like, as a, like, in the weeds, enjoys nutrition and metabolism scientist, I can say, yeah, like, it looks like, if we look at these 3 different common saturated fatty acids, which are present in varying proportions in different types of, foods that are considered high in saturated fat, we see that each individual fatty acid has a different impact on the blood lipid profile, which then has a different impact on the long-term risk of atherosclerotic, plaque formation, heart disease, etc. But again, this semester, I'm actually teaching a new course here at Duke that's physical activity for public health. So we don't do too much of the nutrition, but it's definitely got me more, it's got my brain thinking more in a public health kind of vibe. And you have to be realistic in terms of the messaging. This is one of the reasons why Helms, like, we have limits typically in nutrition guidelines on sodium intake, right? And the reality is there's some percentage of the population genetically that is sensitive to sodium in the diet, and when they consume an excess amount of it, their blood pressure goes up. And since hypertension is so prevalent, and that's a non-negligible chunk of the population, the general recommendation is limit your sodium below what is honestly a fairly low level compared to average intakes. And that's because for most people in the population, that will either help or not harm. But there is a small percentage of the population who is actually like inverse salt sensitive, where when they go on a very low sodium diet, their blood pressure goes up. right? And so for public health messaging, sometimes we have to just kind of say the broadly speaking, generally for most people, limiting sodium seems to be the move, but if you have hypertension, talk to your physician so that you can troubleshoot that and get individualized advice. So again, the public health messaging, it's important to highlight, is not, I promise you, individual, if you do this, you will be in the most healthy spot you could possibly be, right? This is for the general population, what seems to be setting up the vast majority of people for good health. And that's obviously a very layperson distorted kind of definition. But anyway, all that is to say, I think it's good that they retained the recommendation to limit saturated fat to no more than 10% of calories. That seems to be a strong recommendation and has been utilized for quite some time. And like you said, Helms, it's just going to be very tough when you see on the top row in big font, you got a big old hunk of cheese and those turkey thighs and, it's a big old juicy steak, and say, yeah, by the way, here's all the good healthy stuff that's really, really large on the picture. Just make sure you have less than 10% of your calories from saturated fat. It's going to be hard to do that. And then when it comes to, seed oils, they advise against consumption of them, due to concerns about oxidation, mostly driven by mechanistic stuff. And especially like, what's his name? Is it Carnivore MD? What's the seed oil guy? He
Oh
moved out to
yeah,
Costa Rica.
yes, I Paul Saladino.
Yeah, Paul Saladino. So if you really want to deep dive into what people worry about when they panic about, seed oils and all the mechanisms, and it's always going to go into, petri dishes or rodent models. There's all that out there, but basically when we start looking at like what practically and tangibly happens when we actually get people to move their seed oil intake or polyunsaturated fat intake up or down, when it moves up, people either appear to get healthier or have no change. And so it's really, really hard to sell me on all the mechanistic panic about seed oils when, maybe you don't want to feed your pet rat a huge amount of seed oil based
Genetically
chow.
bred.
Yeah,
Yeah,
your
pet
genetic
rat.
mutant rat who is your pet, and you want it to live a nice long life. Maybe you think about what kind of chow you want to give it. But when it comes to humans, we have like actual randomized controlled trials where we have manipulated just, are we going to give you more saturated fat in these muffins, or are we going to give you more of these seed oils? And sliding more seed oils into their diet makes them healthier. So if that is the panic, I'm fine with it. I will take that risk head on of accidentally improving my health. So yeah, the fat stuff, it's a mixed bag. I think the net of it is pretty negative, but at least I'm glad that they seemingly forgot to remove the the limit on saturated fat, because it doesn't really make sense with all the other stuff.
Yeah, I think this is probably another instance where, like, I would guess, I don't have any evidence to back this up, that even on this new committee, there was substantial internal debate. Because
Yeah.
just knowing the publication track record of some of the people on this committee, I think some people probably would have been a little more bullish on there's no issue with saturated fat, and others would have been like, listen, how do we get around this data? And they probably came to a thing where they're saying, well, these specific foods are probably fine, but overall saturated fat intake needs to be limited. I'm guessing that's what it looked like.
Yeah.
Also, given the specific recommendation of full fat dairy, really briefly, I think this is kind of interesting. I'll get into the weeds for people who are interested in dairy and why it's sometimes important to focus on food and food matrices, not just the content. So, like if you think dairy, you might think butter, cream, and you might think yogurt. But non-fat yogurt, hard cheese, soft cheese, full fat yogurt, butter, and cream are all made from the same place, like cow milk, right? But they, because of their food matrix, is going to have a different impact on various aspects of heart health. So, dairy is full fat dairy is less consistently shown to be related to heart health when you control for other factors. That is true, and it's also the largest contributor of saturated fat to the American diet. And as you said, saturated fat does tend to be a strong indicator for issues with heart health. So how the heck can those things all be true? Well, there are essentially there's like a three-layered shield in certain types of dairy related to the food matrix. So like there is the actual what's called the MFGM, and that's the milk fat globule matrix. So essentially, the the fat in dairy itself is encapsulated in these globules, which prevents a fair amount of its own absorption, somewhere around 10 to 20%, depending upon the source, from actually being absorbed. So it's essentially moving through your digestive tract, not being fully absorbed. So when you have full fat dairy, it's essentially like inbuilt to be 15 or 20% less of its fat, which is, largely saturated fat. And then there's another aspect that the calcium content inside of yogurt and the fact that it can drive your digestive tract to be shifting the acidity a bit, that creates what's called saponification, which just means like the creation of soap. And it kind of flushes out fat from your diet broadly. So if you eat a high calcium diet, largely from yogurt, where this is primarily found, it kind of blocks around 4 to 6 grams of fat just generally throughout the day. And that adds up over time. So you're getting that in full fat yogurt. You're getting that kind of shield. And you're also getting this like cholesterol and calcium blocking effect. And the fermentation, the viscosity, also slows the absorption rate and has more time for the matrix to do its thing. So you see this effect more consistently in yogurt than you do milk, even though they should be having some of the same effect. Now in non-fat milk, you're not getting that MFGM, but there's no fat, right? And in non-fat yogurt, you're getting the effect of the like the matrix of calcium and protein and the viscosity and the fermentation, but there's no fat for it to not absorb from itself. So there's these multiple layers. And when you're talking about butter and cream, you've essentially removed them all due to the processing. So it's one thing I'd be okay with saying, okay, listen, they're cool with full fat dairy, and from a pure heart health reductionist perspective, not a problem. But then when they go to recommend cooking with beef tallow and butter, I'm like, okay, now we're stretching the limits of credulity. And more importantly is that we have an issue with overall excess calorie consumption as well. And there's no way around the fact that full fat dairy is a higher calorie liquid. So it's not going to be providing the same kind of satiety. And this is where I think we can, talk about this later as we talk about maybe alcohol and also the processed food recommendation. But to plant a seed for what we're going to talk about later, this doesn't just impact the decisions that individual Americans make and what they put in their shopping cart. It impacts things like school lunches for disadvantaged and lower socioeconomic people. Maybe that's the only square meal they're really getting is their school lunch program, or women's, infants, and children, the WIC program, or SNAP program. So we'll talk about that in a second. But all this is to say, I would be okay with them saying, listen, we don't have to exclusively go with like non-fat or low-fat dairy, some limited exclusion of full-fat dairy, especially yogurts or harder cheeses. That's probably fine. And it's certainly better than, say, red meat, and definitely better than processed meat. If someone had said that, like, okay, you could create a tier list here of what's more likely to cause heart health issues, even though saturated fat might be equivalent between these two sources, don't worry about the full-fat Greek yogurt. I would think that'd be fine, but that's not what they said. They said include more full-fat dairy, making it sound like it's better than non-fat or low-fat dairy, which I would not put them ranked in that way. And then explicitly said, oh, by the way, butter and beef tallow, good to go, which I think is just completely contradicted by the totality of evidence.
Yeah, I agree. I must express a small level of concern, Helms, because before we recorded, you mentioned that it was my job to rein you in and kind of keep you moving along here, and you've referenced at least 3 more major topics for us to discuss, and I do want to surface the comment that we are over an hour and 20 minutes in. So what I'm going to humbly suggest is that we give the ultra concise look at processed foods and alcohol, and then allocate a little more effort or more focus and attention to the kind of big picture messaging. How does that sound?
Okay. Here's what we're going to do. You're going to model for me how to do this, because I am, if anything, just a wannabe Trex. So talk to me about the alcohol recommendations.
I'll take the alcohol. Alcohol very concisely was funny. Okay. So the reason I say that is It was really interesting because I saw that the guideline come out, and it basically said limit alcohol, period. Previously, it had said limit alcohol to no more than one daily drink for females and two daily drinks for males. Now, when I read that with a very literal perspective, which is the one I carry with me always, I said, oh, that makes sense. We used to kind of suggest, well, maybe honestly, light alcohol intake is better than none. Like, so maybe we can treat one or two drinks as, from a health perspective, totally equivalent, if not better than zero. But newer research has come out, and what we find is a lot of those previous analyses that we kind of, really hitched our wagon to scientifically, they were really confounded by, for example, people who are of such poor health that they cannot drink alcohol. So they go to zero alcohol by default because they have an existing medical condition, where alcohol is just off the table. And so when you do more thorough analyses, more nuanced updates, we kind of find from a purely physical health perspective, the most healthy alcohol intake is none. And when you have a little bit of alcohol, it's a little worse than none. And when you have a lot of alcohol, it's a lot worse than even a little. So there's this nonlinear risk. Zero is great. A little bit is fine, but not optimal. But you're not talking about major risk elevations. But once you start getting into the moderate range, now we're saying, okay, you're increasing your risk of various chronic diseases. And when you get into heavy drinking, we just always known it's absolutely disastrous for your health. Like, that's never been a debate. So I saw the recommendation, limit alcohol, and I was like, oh, cool. So we're not confusing people and saying, yeah, 0, 2 drinks, it's all the same. We're just letting people know the healthiest intake is 0. But then Dr. Oz, notable scientist, notable thought communicator, notable leader in science, came out in front of a podium, and someone asked him to elaborate on that.
Really quickly, Trex.
Yes.
When this got pointed out to me, I was like, why do we care what Dr. Oz says, having forgotten the change in his status from him just being the Dr. Oz, because I haven't been in the States for 14 years, to actual public health figure.
Yeah.
It still just blows my mind that's where we're at.
Dude, he ran for Senate. Like, he was almost a senator. So anyway, Dr. Oz is no longer just like shilling raspberry ketone supplements as a miracle fat loss drug. Now he's doing things of import in front of podiums. But he was asked to elaborate on this. And honestly, Helms, I'm not even going to like bash him as if there's some kind of like malicious intent. There's not. He just looked like he was asked to explain something and he forgot whether or not they turned the dial up or down on alcohol. Like he forgot, wait a minute, was our guideline more permissive than the old one or less permissive? And so what he did was he offered an explanation for both. And it was a 1 minute, it was literally like less than 60 seconds. But he basically started off by saying, the healthiest intake of alcohol is 0. And I was like, perfect. End of sentence. Step away from the microphone. But then he said, on the other hand, a lot of people get together and drink. A lot of people get together and drink socially, and social isolation has its own health risk. And if you look at the blue zones, they seem to love their wine and they live basically forever, as long as you don't check their birth records. And so it was just a mess. So I was in this really weird position because of course I have friends and family members all over the political spectrum. Basically, people took from that what they would, and it was very politicized and distorted and confusing. And so I was basically in this weird position where I had to sit down people on all sides of the political aisle and say, in an apolitical way, Dr. Oz is an idiot. After moving past that fact, the recommendation as written is an upgrade that is more compatible with our best evidence available, but the way it was communicated completely detracted from that improvement and made it seem as if the guideline is actually more lenient. And he literally said in the quote, after he was kind of saying, but you don't want to be socially isolated, go have a drink with your buddies. People in the blue zones drink all the time. They seem to be fine. Just don't have alcohol for breakfast, which made it seem like he was basically saying, honestly, it's 5 o'clock somewhere. Just, if you want to have a few a night, I'm not going to count. So it was just a mess of communication while also acknowledging, like, I actually think the guideline itself is better.
So basically just avoid restaurants when happy hour is 8 to 9 a.m. and everything else is on the table.
Yeah, so it's true. Just you should minimize your alcohol to the extent that it suits your lifestyle. If you do engage in some degree of drinking, ideally that would be social drinking where it is limited, moderation each time you drink, and moderation in terms of the frequency of your drinking. And I know several entities have suggested maybe putting a per week limit of something like 1 or 2 drinks per week, which I think gives people sufficient balance to go, you know, enjoy a drink with their spouse, with their business associates, and have the best of all worlds.
I think you did a great job with that. And not only am I going to take the ball and run with it in that same concise manner, you did a good job of reiterating how some of the issues we've had are not just with what is written or what is being indicated, but how that's communicated. We talked about the inverted pyramid and its issues. We've talked about the Dr. Oz, public statements, and that extends as well more broadly into the processed food recommendation. So overall, I think it's a really good thing to say you should consume less processed food. And, if I'm going to be strictly in line with what I've said previously, approach goals are better than avoidance goals. You could even frame, hey, eat real food in a positive light, assuming we're all on the same page with what is processing and what is real food, and that these guidelines are targeted at the right people with the right level of nuance. And it's where those assumptions fall down where the issue is. So the first thing is they did not use ultra processed food as a definition, which I'm not sure if that's a good thing or not, because right now ultra processed food is a loaded term in the scientific community that is being debated. And ultimately, ultra processed food by Montero and colleagues, it's a clear definition, but it is based upon the degree of processing, not the healthfulness of a given food. So something like a non-fat Greek yogurt is more processed than a full-fat Greek yogurt, right? Something like whey protein or milk protein concentrate are different degrees of processing. If you take a perfectly good, tuna or salmon and you can it, all of a sudden it's more processed, but it's also more convenient. It lasts longer. You might be more able to get into food deserts, et cetera, et cetera. And if you're a personal trainer and you're sitting down with someone who has the socioeconomic status to hire you at $100 per session 3 times per week, telling them to eat more real food is fine. But when you say that to the entirety of the American society, and we look at the current economic climate, where the foods at the top of this inverted pyramid are far more expensive than processed foods, which may still be healthy in certain classes, like I just discussed, now we've got a problem. Now we're communicating things that we're not all sure are on the same page. There's not necessarily scientific agreement as to what is ultra processed food, and there's definitely not agreement to what is highly processed, which is the intentional language here. And I think you can contextualize it a little bit by saying, hey, eat whole foods, eat real foods, eat single ingredient food items, and that is valid advice. But the problem is, and this is the final thing that I'll dovetail right from it, just to really be clear, the new guidelines say eat minimal amounts or less, or whatever the verbiage is where you're looking, of highly processed foods. I agree with that, and the data does suggest from Kevin Hall, nonetheless, and other NIH-funded studies that eating more highly processed or ultra-processed foods results in excess energy consumption, increases in adiposity, and risk factors for all-cause mortality, cardiovascular disease, and metabolic disease. Not debated, right? But that is because there's a lot of covariance between ultra-processing, hyperpalatable, saturated fat intake, sugar intake, lower fiber intake, and all these individual nutrient effects and food matrices that have been removed. So we could probably tease apart why ultra-processed foods are a problem. And there are enough instances that it's an issue to where certain processed foods are actually good that we don't want to be cutting out. And that is a challenging nuance to communicate to the public. And it's a potentially tone deaf at best thing to be telling the general public when people are relying on things like social programs and federal programs. And that is the next topic that I'm going to just immediately go to so we're efficient. Okay, so
Perfect.
academically good, highly processing, but here's an issue. Americans don't follow guidelines. That is true. People do not carry around the 164-page pamphlet from 161-page pamphlet from, to 2020 to 2025 when they go to the grocery store This is a clinician-facing document that's supposed to help policymakers and doctors, right? They're not going, oh, what should I buy when they're going down the aisles looking at the cereals.
As a rule, Helms,
They are,
we do not like being told what to do.
no,
It doesn't
we
matter
do
how
not.
good your stupid little guidelines are. Once you tell me to do it, I'm going to tell you, I think I'll do anything else. Thank you very much.
America. America. Yeah. And I think it's a combination of not just that, but also the decisions people make are going to be based upon the short-term incentives and rewards that dominate our lives, especially when we're living check to check. And also it's just hard to connect what I had for breakfast today to whether or not in 20 years I die 5 years earlier than I otherwise would have, or whether my quality of life is lower because I don't have the counterfactual to compare it, right? What tastes good, what's affordable, these things are going to be dominating. What do we have access to, like in food deserts, that are going to be dominating our decisions? So Americans don't follow the guidelines, but it's really important to understand that the policy facing DGAs, which is what they are primarily designed for, and clinician facing DGAs, are going to have direct impact on what do government buyers purchase and put on their menu and in front of people, like members of the military, members of social service, uh, education like systems, like the national school lunch program may be forced to remove yogurt. It may be forced to have to only use full fat milk. And in the lowest like socioeconomic status communities in the U.S., it's not Africa. We're not dealing with a complete lack of calories. We're dealing with things like obesity and metabolic disease, where the majority of the foods they consume are hyperpalatable processed foods, and they're over consuming calories, and giving them a higher calorie liquid, consumption for the 1 square meal they get. That's probably a mistake, and there's going to be potential other issues with that. So the DGAs need to be quantifiable and enforceable on the federal policy side of things. So this is going to create some issues, and it might have substantive changes which do impact the most vulnerable Americans when we're talking about how is it going to impact women, infants, and children, the WIC program. How is it going to impact what was called, food stamps back in the day? How is it going to impact the school lunch program? How does it affect the guidance that's given through things like Medicare, Medicaid? So all of this stuff is not considered by the typical talking heads in our space. We just go, yeah, Americans don't follow the guidelines, it doesn't matter. But it is going to change 1 out of 3 meals for, every American going to a public school who is buying or who's getting the subsidized school lunch program. It's going to impact women and children in lower economic status and people who are getting government assistance. It's going to be impacting the elderly. It's going to be impacting a lot of people who we care about, who we don't think about because we're going, right, well, what do I buy at the grocery store? What do my clients do as personal trainers? And I understand that. Honestly, until I wrote this article, I did not know this. So I'm not sitting here going, how dare you not think about this? I'm not a public health RD. I'm a sports nutrition researcher, right? So this has been an eye-opening experience to write these guidelines, Trex. And I think it's really critically important to understand that the DGAs are not just things that are ignored, but they do influence a substantial amount of the food that is in U.S. society. And unfortunately, I think the ambiguous terminology related to processing and the inability to quantify, or the challenge in actually making some of the math work that you talked about in the fat section, may create some actual negative health impacts despite their best intentions. And I don't think anyone's intending to harm anybody with these DGAs, but I do think that the rush to get them done and releasing public-facing documentation and images simultaneously with the DGAs, and having this kind of cultural zeitgeist of we're going to try to connect with this ancestral, anti-establishment thing as we release it, and this fanfare, and honestly pandering to that community and talking about how it used to be bad back in the day, and these misinformation from the last administration, this politicization of this process is going to have measurable negative impacts. And I don't say that as someone who's on the left and right spectrum. I say that just saying, hey, the politicization generally, regardless of which way you go, is potentially going to harm people or at least confuse them. But the final thing I'll say, Trex, is that if you were to look at the current dietary guidelines for Americans compared to the last one, I'd say they're actually, in more ways than not, further away from the evidence base, particularly if we talk about the saturated fat, or rather, some of the dietary fat guidance. That's my take.
Yeah, and I think I agree, and I think in some cases, as they were trying to work toward what is, let's be candid, a contrarian point, they ended up introducing new terminology, eschewing old recommendations, introducing new ones that are so vague as to, as you're alluding to, lead us away from a health promoting dietary pattern in the broadest sense. So, for example, it was a lot simpler when we could tell people eat more vegetables, eat more fruits, eat more lean proteins. Once you start saying, well, no, get like a good fatty steak. And then you're like, well, crap, now we have to adjust the definition for what is a healthy fat. And they're like, well, crap, but we didn't really change how much saturated fat is permissible. So now you're just kind of stuck in this, like, people who have no business to be playing macro Tetris are now playing saturated fat Tetris, trying to fit all of their new healthy fats into this dietary pattern. And in reality, what we used to just say was, well, try to eat mostly lean protein sources. You don't need to go out of your way to get fat in the human diet. It will be there. Believe me. Like, if you've ever prepped and your coach says, hey, by the way, we're going to do a real serious push here, and you're down to 35 grams of fat per day, you don't have fat sources. You have protein sources and carb sources, and even those are starting to get whittled down just to make it possible to hit your fat or stay within your fat limit. But yeah, if we're talking about like getting enough fat to have a healthy diet, it is not a consideration. So when we just told people, hey, some legumes, some nuts and seeds, lean proteins, it was all very simple, Helms. And did people do it broadly? No. But was it at least like cohesive, and did it all fit together in a way that, if followed, would have nudged someone toward a healthy dietary pattern? I believe so. So I'm in this weird position where I don't online get into a lot of politicized stuff. I aim to be, both when I'm in the classroom and when I'm just out public facing, I aim for people to really not know that much about where I'm at politically, like, because it's just not my thing. But in this case, in a purely apolitical sense, like, I wasn't like pissed off and like shaking my fist about these guidelines, because I don't think they're tragically worse. But it is kind of silly that we're treating it as if we kind of like had this massive paradigm shift. And in reality, we retain most of what there used to be, and the substantive changes that we see are in the net unhelpful and actually somewhat counterproductive. I do like eating more protein. I do like limiting alcohol. If we could message that well, that would be preferable. But yeah, in the net, I think we just said, you idiots don't know what you're doing. We're taking charge, and then eventually just kind of messed it up.
Yep, I tend to agree. There's basically three issues here: how they were developed, and the addition of a oversight committee that didn't act as oversight but had less oversight on itself and was like a countermanding committee. There was those relatively minor in the grand scheme issues with the what. Although, like, man, the saturated fat one's kind of a tough thing.
It's just
But largely
illogical.
the
Yeah, it's just tough to.
correct,
You can't square it.
but largely the communication, right? So I actually think it probably wouldn't be that bad if you could wave a magic wand and go, yeah, beef tallow, butter, and full fat dairy are on the menu so long as you don't go over 10% saturated fat. I'd be like, all right, well, it'll be a frustrating diet to write, but it is possible. It's possible, right?
Yeah.
But it's possible for you and I, or a registered dietitian with a tool like MyPlate. It's not possible from going from a flash website that talks about, the evils of the last guide to recommendations. No, oh, how do I do that, government? You just eat real food. Catch you later. So, yeah, it's not like they have a MyPlate interactive tool yet, and maybe they will, to be charitable.
Yeah.
But I agree that I think the main issue is the communication, not necessarily the what. And then a secondary issue, which I think a lot of people are not aware of, which I'm glad that we're kind of being a voice on, is that there was a whole other new committee added to this. This is increased bureaucracy and reduced transparency, despite this veneer of simplicity, eat real food message. So,
Yeah.
yeah, that's the mass position stand. And I think the final thing I do want to close out with is that um, we have a lot of American listeners, and obviously this will directly affect Americans, but there are other bodies outside of the U.S., believe it or not, people from the U.S. There are other countries even, and they're not all just shithole countries. There's actually some functional societies outside of the U.S. that I've heard. And the use of that terminology was a joke and alluding to a comment of a politician. I don't actually view any countries as
It's
shitholes.
too late. The
Please,
the live chat has destroyed you. Your
they've
career's tarnished.
I've
Yeah,
been canceled.
it's over.
All right. Well, I tried.
Yeah.
Well, in this last bit of fumbling through my cancellation, I do want to point out that, for example, the UK, they have had guidelines based on a similar evidentiary practice of collecting systematic reviews and having oversight, as well as the healthy diet indicator criteria, which I think I butchered that name, but you've written about this in Mass, how there's the, I think the 2015 and the 2020 guidelines from the World Health Organization, which they take nutrition researchers that are not attached to any single government, and they've developed these criteria. And actually, another one that I mentioned offhand that I didn't intend to bring up, Athlete's Plate, which is sports dietitians from University of Colorado Springs as well as the Olympic Training Facility. They've all independently done a similar, like, systematic evidence-based process, and they have remarkably similar guidelines. So you can look to the last DGA cycle. You can look to the UK guidelines, which I think were developed in 2015. They're due for an update, but still. You can look to the 2020 healthy eating indicator criteria from WHO. I think I got it right that time. And they come to extremely similar recommendations, maybe quibbling over, like, should it be 10 or 12 grams of fiber per 1,000 calories, right?
Yeah.
But generally, it's like eat more fruits and vegetables, legumes, lean proteins, and reduce consumption of saturated fat, sugars, sodium, and overall processed foods when they go out on that limb. But often they don't. They just kind of describe the bad aspects of them. So if you look at those and you value being evidence-based, you can say, where do they differ from this current cycle of American guidelines? That's the kind of that's the issue. That's the one you can go, maybe that's where the current subversion of the process led us astray.
Yeah, and to even reinforce your point earlier, you were talking about how this stuff does actually matter. It is true. We had someone, Java Guru, in the live chat mentioned that many schools also serve breakfast for a lot of low-income students. So for a lot of people, these will at least have the potential to impact at least two of the meals that they consume on a daily basis. And in many cases, those are the two most reliable meals and the two most nutritious meals historically. So a lot of potential for some issues here. So I think you did a fantastic job talking through the process. I learned a lot reviewing your article, which will be available soon at massresearchreview.com. Is it available yet or available soon?
I don't think they. This is Mike Zerdos might even be watching this. He often does, but
it'll be available.
Mike and Lauren are working on it
soon,
very soon,
if not immediately. But I think soon at massresearchreview.com. Check it every day. That's my recommendation broadly. Just make that part of your daily schedule. Now, wake up, check massresearchreview.com, and then go about your day. But you talk in even greater detail about these guidelines and other guidelines that you can cross-reference. But ultimately, I think you did a great job kind of summarizing this. And if I could throw in my final 2 cents, Helms, it's so disappointing. So I joked about how, ancestral eating and paleo is my next grift. But like all jokes, there's a little hint of truth to it in the sense I'm not going to become a paleo grifter, but I was recently making slides for an undergraduate course talking about energy balance. And, I do like to incorporate, like any research or any teacher is going to be more engaging when they can lean on some of the research that they do or their lab does. And so I'm incorporating some of the stuff that Poncer Lab has historically done with the Hadza community in Tanzania and with other hunter-gatherer groups, and even looking at archaeological evidence of, historic hunter-gatherer groups, from what we've been able to ascertain. And what's really kind of sad about it is you can construct what I believe is a coherent and rigorously defensible narrative explaining how the modern food environment has deviated in tremendous ways from our kind of ancestral food environment and drawing clear parallels to how that has generally not served us well in industrialized, affluent economies. It You do not find a lot of hunter-gatherer groups that still have essentially zero market integration where we have rampant obesity. It doesn't exist. So you can kind of talk through these ideas of the abundance of calories, hyperpalatability, the ways we've modified food to make them super palatable, way too easy to eat, way too fast to eat, and we've optimized foods to what are normally our evolutionary cues. So from an evolutionary perspective, if we simply just ate the same way that you would find any species and you discovered a new species, you would say, what does it eat? You know what I mean? Like there's like a few basic things about any species. What does it eat and when does it sleep? Is it nocturnal or not? And what is its dietary pattern? If you were to describe the human dietary pattern in our kind of pure ancestral form, we follow our taste buds and we seek out things with high energy density. And usually what leads us to that is palatability and food texture. And we also, as a rule, as far as I can tell, every human community that's ever existed cooks its food. Like every single one. And why do we cook it? Because it changes the texture and the mouthfeel. So we basically have evolved to just go, you plop us in any environment, high latitude to low latitude. We may be almost vegan. We may be almost carnivores. You drop us anywhere on the planet, and there are two guarantees. We will seek out things that are as palatable as we can find with the highest energy density we can find, and we will cook stuff. That is the human diet. And now that we live in a food environment, historically, that would lead us to berries, whatever meat we could hunt, and a few other miscellaneous things, and we would have a BMI of 22. That's how it's always worked. But now when you seek out the things with the most pleasant mouthfeel, the highest energy density, the highest palatability, now we end up in a situation where you can mindlessly overeat in some literally randomized controlled trials, 500, 800 calories per day. And all it takes to become obese over the span of your adult life is overeating by less than 0.5%. An extra 4,500 calories a year perpetually from the age of 18 to 55, depending on your height and various characteristics. I've modeled it out. You get obese by overeating by that much. So yeah, when we drop this, atomic bomb of lifestyle change where we hardly move and our food environment is completely different, like you can make a smart, rational kind of explanation of here's the ancestral kind of rationale for why things have not gone so well for us in the last few decades. But you don't have to then go to like, by the way, have you thought about eating more butter? It's just like, it's such an own goal where it's like you could have really played this well and still ended up with good dietary guidelines. And the thing that's really frustrating about it is the dietary guidelines that were in place really did go a long way in putting guardrails to kind of help us through this modern food environment in a way that you could tie back to this kind of ancestral rationale of like, oh, well, here's why we need to put some limitations on these extra fats that find their way into our diet, these sugars that we don't necessarily need in abundance, right? So that's long-winded and a bit of a tangent, but it sucks because if you go the ancestral route in terms of just kind of explaining to people why we're in the situation we're in with overweight and obesity rates in excess of 70% in many populations, you immediately like get boxed into this like, oh, well, this guy's a quack. And it's like, well, no, many quacks do like to go this route, but there's a way to go this route and not be a quack. So I do feel compelled to defend the actual rigorous work that's being done to evaluate what is kind of the default ancestral human diet. How have we deviated from that? And ultimately, that's where dietary guidelines come into play, is helping us navigate this insane revolution in food that's happened over the last 10,000 years. And let's be honest, the last 60. You know what I mean? Like, we can talk about the agricultural revolution, but even then, there was like 9,800 years of like pretty smooth sailing, right? And then just in the matter of no time, the way we've changed our food environment, like I said, in the last 50, 70, 80 years has been just absolutely astronomical. So Helms, all that is to say, I think you did a fantastic job. And folks, if you have zero patience for some of these discussions related to ancestral diets and what we can learn from them, you are going to dislike my content more and more by the day, I think.
No, you did a fantastic job with that. For those who are Looking for some more depth, like we said, we've got it on the website soon. We're also going to be uploading an audio summary that I do, which I promise will be shorter than this one, probably to the tune of 20 to 30 minutes. I will commit to that, that you can listen to. And folks, the one thing I will say is I dodged the bullet releasing the muscle and strength pyramids just before these new DGAs dropped. And I also protected myself because now I will refuse to update my books until the next set of DGAs are in line with the evidence better. So I'm basically good. I don't have to write another book at least until 2030 Trex. So that's good news.
Yeah.
But I just want to say thank you to everybody for tuning into this episode of Iron Culture presented by MASS. We really hope that this was an informative take on the history that has influenced the creation of the DGAs up to the present moment, the culture that has influenced it, because the left-right political spectrum in the U.S. is absolutely a cultural phenomenon, which unfortunately has influenced these DGAs, and also the science. So you understand where the aspects of the what are actually closer in line with the science, even if they weren't communicated well. Because again, it's not just wholly bad or wholly good, these new DGAs. And now you are more educated and hopefully better informed. Maybe not more optimistic for our future, but nonetheless, you know the MASS position stand on the DGAs. We want to thank you for tuning in. Make sure, if you need lifting straps or any type of lifting gear, that you head over to Elite FTS and you use our discount code. That's MMR10 for MASS Research Review 10. And of course, if you really want to help us out, then do subscribe to MASS Research Review. If you like that free content, trust me, that is just the tip of the iceberg of the type of stuff we have for our subscribers. So we want to thank you for tuning in, for listening, and we will catch you not every Monday from now on, but at this new recording time on Tuesdays. And I can't wait to see you next week.
Take care, everybody.